The spring they turned 72, Margaret and Harold Payne had $5 and each other. They had raised 3 children in a house they owned for 34 years, tended its garden through 34 springs, repainted its shutters the same shade of dusty blue every time the color faded, and then watched their eldest son Clifford slide a stack of documents across that house's kitchen table and tap the signature line with one finger, and they had signed. They had not understood fully what they were signing. They understood afterward. By May, the house belonged to a trust their children controlled. By June, Margaret and Harold were politely informed that alternative living arrangements would need to be made within 90 days. They found what they needed at a municipal auction on a Tuesday morning, a rusted houseboat seized for unpaid mortgage fees, 31 years of another woman's life piled inside it, going for $5 because nobody else wanted it. They did not know yet what was hidden beneath the main berth. They did not know that the boat had been waiting. They only knew it was theirs. If a story like this one speaks to something you believe in, that it is never too late, and that quiet people sometimes find exactly what they need, we would love to have you subscribe to this channel. And tell us in the comments tonight where you're watching from. We genuinely want to know. Margaret and Harold had not been wealthy people. That was the first thing to understand, because it mattered to everything that came next. They had been comfortable, not the same thing. Harold had spent 31 years as a high school drafting teacher, careful and methodical. The kind of teacher who remembered students' names 20 years after graduation and occasionally received letters saying so. Margaret had worked part-time for 2 decades at the county library, cataloging periodicals and helping the older patrons navigate the card catalog and, later, the computers that replaced it. She had liked both jobs equally, the card catalog for its order, the computers for the way they surprised her. They had never taken a cruise. They had never owned a second car less than 4 years old. But they had paid off the mortgage on the house on Elm Fork Road in the summer Harold turned 63, and that house, a 3-bedroom bungalow with a deep back porch and a kitchen garden Margaret replanted every April, had felt like the solid ground beneath everything else. They had each other too. That had always been the truest thing. 48 years of marriage, through the years when the children were small and the money was short and the furnace went out in February, and through the years when the children left and the house grew wide and quiet and good in a way that took some getting used to. Harold made coffee every morning, the same brand, the same strength, every day, and set Margaret's cup on the bedside table before she was fully awake, and had done so for so long that she reached for it before she opened her eyes. It was the kind of love that doesn't make for a dramatic story. It was the kind that holds. Their 3 children were grown and scattered. Clifford in the city, 2 hours north. Diane in the next state over. Young Paul, who was not so young anymore at 44, living on the coast with his family. They visited at holidays. They called with reasonable regularity. By ordinary measure, it was a family that functioned. What went wrong slowly, and almost entirely out of sight. Clifford had always been the one who managed things. Even as a child, he had been the organizer, the one who distributed Halloween candy into tidy piles and tracked who owed whom a favor from the previous recess. As an adult, he worked in financial services and spoke with the easy authority of a man accustomed to knowing more about money than the people he was speaking with. He had been the one, 2 years before the signing, to first raise the idea of the family trust. He had explained it over Sunday dinner at their house, sat at their table, with Margaret's pot roast going cold while he talked, and the explanation had been detailed and confident and had used a number of words that sounded technical and reassuring simultaneously. The basic idea, as he presented it, was protection. Estate planning. A way to ensure that, when the time came, the house would pass to the children without the delays and costs of probate. Harold listened carefully and asked 3 questions. Clifford answered them in ways that seemed to address what was asked. They did not consult an independent attorney. Clifford said it wasn't necessary. The documents came by courier 18 months later. Clifford came with them, flying down on a Thursday, taking the early flight and the late one home. He sat across from them at the kitchen table with his coat still on and walked them through the papers quickly, page by page, tapping the signature lines with one finger as he reached each one. He did not read the full text aloud. He summarized. The summaries were brisk and reassuring. When Margaret paused on the 3rd page and said she wasn't certain she understood the ownership transfer clause, Clifford said it was standard language. He said it meant nothing had changed, practically speaking, and that she should think of it simply as putting the house somewhere safer. She signed. Harold signed. Clifford gathered the documents, shook Harold's hand, kissed Margaret's cheek, and was back at the airport by 4 in the afternoon. The letter arrived 11 months later. It was from a law firm, not Clifford's personal attorney, but a firm she had never heard of, and it explained that the trust had been restructured, that certain debts had been secured against the property, and that as trust administrators, the children had agreed that it would be necessary for the primary residents to make alternative living arrangements within 90 days. Margaret called Clifford when the letter arrived. She was crying before he picked up, and she was still crying when she told him what it said. There was a pause on his end. She heard the small sounds of an office in the afternoon. Then, he said he was sorry she was upset, and that he would have his attorney send over the relevant documentation so they could understand the situation better. He did not come. She heard him shift the phone, just briefly, the small, particular sound of a man glancing at something on his desk. The documentation arrived and confirmed everything the first letter had said. She did not call again. There was nothing left to say to a man who could hear his mother cry and reach for his calendar. Harold put his arm around her at the kitchen table, and she cried until she was empty. Then she dried her face, and they sat quietly for a moment in the kitchen of the house they had lived in for 34 years. "We'll figure it out," Harold said. She believed him. She had always believed him. They had 90 days. They spent the first 2 weeks in a motel on the highway, the kind with a microwave bolted to the wall and a parking lot that faced a drainage ditch, and they looked at apartments. They looked at the costs of apartments. Harold's pension and Margaret's Social Security, combined, made rent feasible but not easy, and the thought of paying rent on a fixed income in a town where rates had been climbing for 3 years did not sit comfortably with either of them. It was Harold who found the listing. He had been in the habit of reading the municipal notices for years, a habit born in the summer. He bought a second-hand drafting table at a county surplus sale for $12, and he saw it on a Wednesday morning, sitting at the motel room's small desk with his coffee. One houseboat. Seized for unpaid mortgage fees. Municipal auction, the following Tuesday. Minimum bid, $5. He read it twice. Then he brought the printout to Margaret, who was sitting on the bed with her reading glasses on and a cup of tea going cold, and he set it in front of her without saying anything. She read it. She took her glasses off. She looked at Harold. "Is the river navigable?" she said. "The listing says it's at a permanent mooring. It doesn't have to go anywhere." She put her glasses back on, looked at the listing again. $5, she said. $5, said Harold. They were quiet for a moment. "Well," said Margaret, "we've spent worse." The auction was held in a parking lot behind the harbormaster's office on a Tuesday morning cold enough to see your breath. 11 bidders had registered, but most of them were there for a boat trailer and a set of marine equipment that came up in the first lot. When the houseboat was called, Lot 9, listed as a 1968 stern-drive houseboat, 42 feet, aluminum hull, condition noted simply as is, 6 of the 11 bidders had already left. The remaining 5 looked at each other briefly. Then, 4 of them looked away. Harold raised his hand with a $5 bid, and the auctioneer, a tired man in a canvas jacket, called it once, called it twice, and knocked it over. The woman who processed the paperwork was named Dottie Wren. She was the marina's office manager, somewhere in her early 60s, with close cropped silver hair and a manner that was matter-of-fact without being unkind. She stamped the transfer document and handed it across the counter, and then paused. "You know what you're getting into?" she said. "Not entirely," said Harold. Dottie nodded, as if that was at least an honest answer. "She sat unoccupied for 4 years," she said. "The owner, an older woman, lived on her alone a long time, passed away without any next of kin that came forward. We kept her moored, hoping somebody would claim her. Nobody did." "What was her name?" Margaret said. "The woman who lived there." "Vera Osman," Dottie said. She said it with a small pause before and after, the way you say the name of someone you respected. "Quiet woman. Knew that river better than anybody alive, I think." She handed them the keys, 2 of them, both old, on a ring with a cork float attached, and wished them luck in a way that sounded like she meant it. They walked the dock together, Harold carrying the 2 bags from the motel, Margaret holding the keys. The boat was moored at the far end, past 3 other houseboats that were clearly lived in. Curtains in the windows, small herb pots on the deck rails, the particular evidence of daily life. The Vera Osman boat was not lived in. That was obvious from 20 feet away. The hull had gone from whatever its original color was to a deep, streaked rust on the lower third, with repair patches along the waterline that had been applied at different times and had weathered differently from each other. The deck railing on the upper level was intact, but it separated from its mounts in 2 places, sagging outward at an angle that would not hold weight reliably. 2 deck boards had split and curled at the edges. The cabin windows were intact, that was something, but covered from inside with a blanket pinned across the glass, as if the last person who lived there had wanted darkness, or privacy, or simply could not find a curtain rod. Harold stepped aboard first, testing each board before committing to it. The boat shifted slightly under his weight, a long, slow rock. He reached back and took Margaret's hand. Inside was a life, or the remnants of one. Vera Osman had not been a minimalist. Every surface held something: stacked books, cardboard sleeves of charts, a drafting table bolted to the wall with tools still clipped to its edge rail, mason jars of pencils and pens sorted by type. A row of technical journals going back 40 years arranged by date along the bottom shelf. The galley had a percolator on the counter, a cast-iron skillet on the hook above the stove, and labeled tins along the upper shelf. Rice, lentils, sea salt, coffee. At the far end of the cabin, the main berth had a mattress in considerable disrepair, resting on a plywood platform. A reading lamp was clipped to the shelf above the pillow. A paperback novel lay face down on the shelf, its spine cracked to hold the place. Vera had stopped reading in the middle, and no one had moved it since. Margaret stood in the middle of that room for a long time. She didn't say anything. She just looked. Then, she took off her coat, draped it over the back of the desk chair, and said, "We'll need to get the windows open." Harold found a propane camp stove in a locker under the galley counter that still had fuel in the canister. He got it running on the second try. He found 2 mugs, hand-thrown pottery mugs, the kind a person buys because they like the feel of them, and made instant coffee from the tin-labeled coffee. And he brought Margaret's cup to her while she was measuring the cabin window frame with a piece of string. She took the cup without looking up from the string, reached for it before she turned. That was when Harold decided they were going to be all right. The man moored in the adjacent slip appeared the following morning. His name was Frank Alva. He was 78, had been living aboard his own boat for 12 years, and had the look of a man who had done enough difficult things in his life that he had stopped being bothered by difficult things. He came to the rail with a length of dock line that Harold needed and had not yet known he needed, and he handed it over and leaned on the post while Harold tied it off. "You're in Vera's boat," Frank said. "We are," said Harold. "Did you know her?" 30-some years. He looked at the boat for a moment. She didn't say much, but she was good to have around. He pushed off the post. "There's a man named Luis at the boatyard on the main dock. Does hull work. He's fair." He turned to go, then paused. "Don't let the upper deck railing fool you. The mounts are solid. Just needs the bolts retorqued." He walked away. That was Frank Alva. It took them 3 weeks to go through the contents of the cabin, and they were not hasty about it. Every book came down and was dusted and stacked. Every box was opened and noted. Vera Osman had been, it became clear, a woman of considerable order beneath the apparent accumulation, nothing carelessly placed, even if it looked that way on first encounter. The books were grouped by subject. The jars were labeled in the same hand. The chart sleeves were numbered in sequence along the spine. The charts themselves slowed everything down. There were 43 sleeves. Each one contained between 1 and 4 individual charts, hand-drawn in ink on drafting paper, the river system rendered over and over from different angles, different seasons, different years, depth readings, current notations, small penciled observations in Vera's narrow, precise handwriting, a life's work of looking carefully at one place and recording what was true of it. Margaret sat on the cabin floor one quiet afternoon with a chart unrolled across her knees, and she looked at it for a long time. She had spent 20 years cataloging things at the library. She knew what it meant when someone spent their life making a record of something they believed mattered. "Harold," she said, "come look at this." He crouched beside her. They looked at it together. "She was remarkable," Margaret said quietly. Then she noticed it, partly hidden under the raised edge of the plywood berth platform, in the shadow that a warped board above cast across the floor, a seam that did not match the rest of the cabin floor. A hatch. Small, set flush, with a brass ring pull gone green with age. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at Harold. If you've stayed with Margaret and Harold this far, and we're glad you have, please consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss where this story goes next. We put these out every week, and we'd love to have you here for all of them. Harold pulled the hatch open. It moved smoothly, sealed with a wax gasket that had held well enough that the space below was dry. Below the hatch was a void, roughly the size of a small suitcase, lined with the same deliberate care as the chart sleeves. Someone had thought about preservation. Someone had made a plan. Inside the void was a tin box, and inside the tin box were 3 things. The first was a bundle of letters, tied with waxed cord, all from the same sender, the Harmon Regional Maritime Museum, 114 miles downriver. Addressed to Vera Osman, care of the Marina, spanning 8 years. 8 years of letters. Margaret untied the cord and read the first one, then the last, then several in the middle. The tone throughout was respectful and consistent. The museum had become aware of Vera's chart collection through a reference in a professional journal. They believed the collection to be of significant historical value. They wished to acquire it for their permanent archives and were prepared to discuss a purchase. The final letter, dated 7 years before, noted that they had not received a response to their previous correspondence, and that if Vera wished to decline, they would accept that, but hoped she would write to confirm her wishes. Vera, it appeared, had not written. She had put the letters in a tin box under a sealed hatch, and whatever she had intended to do about them, she had run out of time to do it. The second thing was an unsealed envelope containing cash. $2,200 in bills of various denominations, folded without particular order, accumulated over time. On the outside, in Vera's narrow hand, for whoever comes next and needs a start. Margaret held the envelope for a long time without opening it further. She read the inscription twice. Then, she folded both hands over it and sat quietly. She knew, Margaret said finally. She knew someone would come who needed it. Or she hoped, said Harold. Maybe that's the same thing, Margaret said. The third thing was a photograph, black and white, slightly faded at the edges. A woman standing at the rail of a boat. This boat, recognizable by the stern cleat, looking out at the river. The woman was perhaps 60 in the photograph. Close-cut hair, a plain expression that was not unhappy. On the back, in the same hand, Vera, 1991, Harmon River, mile 44. She was looking at something just past the edge of the frame. Something on the water. Margaret propped the photograph against the percolator on the galley shelf, and it stayed there. Frank came aboard the following Saturday to help Harold retorque the deck railing mounts, a job that needed 2 people and a socket size Frank happened to own. While Harold held the rail, Frank worked the wrench, and Margaret brought cups of coffee out to the deck afterward. The 3 of them sat for a few minutes looking at the river. Vera used to do this, Frank said, after a while. Make coffee, said Margaret. Leave it on the dock railing. He nodded toward the boards below them. Cold mornings, when the heat was slow to come on, some of us older ones, we'd come out, and there would be a pot on the railing where anybody could reach it. Not on her deck. On the dock rail, out where you didn't have to knock. She never made a point of it. You'd just come out, and it would be there. He looked at his cup. Did it for years, right up until she couldn't anymore. Margaret was quiet. She was looking at the river in the same direction Vera had been looking in the photograph, though she didn't know that. Every morning, she said. Cold ones, mainly, said Frank. The following Monday was cold. Margaret was up before Harold, which was unusual, and had the camp stove going and the percolator on before he was awake. When he came out of the berth, she was already in her coat. There was a thermos on the dock railing, closed and warm, with a small paper label that said, "Help yourself." Harold looked at the thermos. He looked at Margaret. Vera's idea, she said simply, and went back inside. Frank noticed it on his way past at 7:15. He didn't say anything about it. He poured a cup, leaned on the dock rail for a moment, watched the river, and walked on. The next morning, a neighbor from 3 slips down, a retired schoolteacher named Bev, who lived aboard with a tabby cat, came out early and stopped at the thermos. She knocked on the cabin door. When Margaret opened it, Bev held up her cup. "Thank you," she said. "That's a kind thing." "It isn't my idea," Margaret said. "It is now," said Bev. It became the thing people on that dock talked about when they talked about Margaret and Harold. Not the renovation, though the renovation was considerable. Not the charts, the story of which would come later. Just the thermos on the railing every cold morning. The thing that was there before you went looking for it. They contacted the Harmon Regional Maritime Museum in the third month. Margaret wrote the letter herself longhand on the marina's stationery. She explained that she and her husband had acquired Vera Osman's houseboat and had found the chart collection, and that they understood the museum had been attempting to reach Vera for some years. She enclosed a numbered list of the sleeves, with a brief description of the date range and coverage of each, organized the way Vera herself had organized them. The museum's response arrived within 2 weeks. It was addressed to both of them and written by the director, a woman named Dr. Harriet Lund, who had been pursuing Vera Osman's collection for 8 of the 12 years she had held the position. The letter was warm and direct. The charts were, she wrote, the most comprehensive hand-documented survey of that river system in existence. 30 years of direct observation at a level of detail no automated survey had matched. The museum wished to acquire the full collection and was prepared to make a formal offer. The formal offer, when it came, was $46,000. Harold sat on the dock in the evening with the letter in both hands, looking at the river. He was not a man given to dramatic expressions of feeling, but he held the letter there for a long time, and he let out a slow, long breath. And the river moved past in the way it always did, indifferent and beautiful. He and Margaret discussed it that night and the following 2 mornings. They agreed to the offer on the 4th day. They hired a retired attorney that Dottie Wren knew and trusted, a man named Tom, who charged fairly and made 2 small changes to the transfer agreement before pronouncing it sound. Margaret signed for both of them, reading every line before she did. The museum sent a specialist, a careful young man named Garrett, who worked in white cotton gloves and asked, every hour or so, whether he was being intrusive. Margaret told him 3 times that he was not, that the charts were going to exactly the right place, and that she was glad someone would care for them properly. On his last day, he shook both their hands and said it was the most significant acquisition he had been part of in 11 years of this work. And he said it looking directly at them, and meant it. They kept the photograph. Vera at the rail in 1991, looking at something on the water. It stayed on the galley shelf. The county paper ran a short feature in the fall. 6 paragraphs, a photograph of the restored boat at its mooring. The reporter, a young woman named Addie, had heard about the thermos on the dock railing and thought there might be a story in it. There turned out to be considerably more of one than she had expected. The piece mentioned the chart collection and the museum acquisition without specifying any amounts. It mentioned Vera. It mentioned the dock railing and the thermos. Clifford called on the Thursday after the paper ran. Margaret answered on the second ring. I saw the article, he said. His voice had its usual composure, the professional ease that did not quite become warmth. It was kind of them to write it, she said. You sound well. We are well, she said. Remarkably so. A brief pause. I'm glad. He began to say something about wanting to come and see the boat sometime, about catching up properly. Margaret listened. She was not unkind. She said that was nice of him to offer. She said they were very busy through the winter. She hoped he was well, and she meant that in the way you can mean something without wanting anything further from it. The call lasted 4 minutes. He tried once more, 2 weeks later. She did not answer, and she did not call back, and she did not feel guilty about it for long. Diane called separately, from the next state, and it was a different conversation. Quieter, Diane cried partway through, and Margaret let her, and did not fill the silence with comfort that wasn't warranted. They said they would write. They did write, occasionally, after that. It was a beginning of a kind, and it was enough. What Margaret had learned at 72, sitting at the galley table, with Vera's photograph on the shelf and the river running past the hull, was that forgiveness was not the same as pretending. You could wish your children well, even the ones who had taken your home from you, and still choose not to make room for them in your new life. Both things could be true at the same time. She had not known, before, that both things could be true at the same time, and knowing it felt like setting something down that she had carried for longer than she realized. By the second winter, the houseboat was something worth seeing, not a showpiece. That was never the intention, but the hull had been recoated by Luis from the boatyard, the deck boards replaced, the railing mounts solid and tight. The windows were clear. The cabin was warm. Margaret had painted the exterior trim in a color close to what she found on a chip of original paint discovered beneath the galley counter, a faded maritime green, and the boat sat at its mooring with the particular dignity of something that has survived long enough to be useful again. Harold still made the coffee every morning. Margaret's cup was on the shelf beside the bed when she opened her eyes. Some things do not change, and are not meant to. She still put the thermos on the dock railing on cold mornings. By the second winter, a small handwritten card had appeared beside it one day, left by someone on the dock. It read simply, "Thank you for this." She never found out who had left it. She kept it anyway, tucked under the photograph of Vera on the galley shelf. They had each other. That had always been the truest thing, and it turned out to be the thing that nothing, no signed document, no legal trust, no letter on heavy paper from a firm she had never heard of, could reach. They had carried it with them into the motel room, and into the auction parking lot, and down the dock, and into Vera Osman's rusted, abandoned, rescued boat. And it was still there, as reliable as the tide. There is something that is always yours, even when everything else can be taken. It cannot be put in a trust. It cannot be restructured or transferred or claimed by a better prepared attorney. It is the thing you reach for before you are fully awake. The question, in the hardest seasons, is only whether you can hold on to it long enough to find out what comes next. The spring they turned 72, Margaret and Harold Payne had $5 and each other. They spent the $5 on a rusted houseboat at a municipal auction, and they made it home. The boat had been waiting. It turned out that was more than enough. If you found something in Margaret and Harold's story tonight, if there is a part of it that felt familiar, or true, or like something you have also carried, please subscribe to the channel and share this with someone you think might need to hear it. And tell us in the comments, what is one thing in your life that turned out to be worth far more than anyone expected? We read every single comment, and we would genuinely love to hear yours. Thank you for being here with us tonight. We will see you in the next one.